Mr. Knaus, you are the director of the European Stability Initiative, a think tank in Berlin. Is this what we have seen last week, the end of your plan, the Turkey deal?
It's very important to understand what this statement was. Exactly 4 years ago, in March 2016, the EU and Turkey agreed on what turned into a press declaration, a statement. It's not an agreement, it's not a legal document, it's not a treaty. It had a massive impact. The EU mobilized 6 billion euros to help refugees in Turkey. The number of people who came fell from 1 million in the 12 months before that moment to 26,000 in the 12 months after.
So it worked. It worked.
So it had a huge impact. It's been the most effective measure the EU has taken in 4 years of trying to deal with the causes of onward migration. And it also did that by helping 680,000 students, Syrian students, go to schools in Turkey, learning Turkish. 1.7 million Syrians in Turkey getting social support. There are health clinics, there are education centers around Turkey funded by this. But it's just a statement, which means it's been based on interests. It's been based on both sides wanting it to work. Mm-hmm. And you ask yourself, when you read this very, very short statement, which is discussed all the time by people, I think, who never read it. You read it and you say, what was the interest of Turkey, which had 3 times more Syrians than the whole EU?
3.6 million people of Syria living in Turkey.
3 times more Syrians, more than 3 times more Syrians refugees than the whole EU, to say to the EU in March 2016, we are prepared to take back refugees from the Greek islands to slow the irregular and very dangerous crossing by boat. 360 people, half of them children, drowned in 10 weeks before the agreement. Why did Turkey do it? Now, a lot of people would be surprised if they hear that politicians in Brussels think Mr. Erdogan thinks about the benefits of the EU, gets up in the morning and says, how can I help the EU? Well, of course he doesn't. It's not altruism. The reason Turkey helped the EU and the reason this worked for 4 years was because Turkey decided that it needed the support of the European Union to deal with the biggest integration challenge in its history.
Are you saying that President Erdogan is right to open up the borders and put pressure on the EU? Because the money ran out. The money that the EU gave to Turkey is almost all spent. So these schools that you're talking about and the Syrian children who are having an education there, that's maybe going to stop. Is Erdogan right?
We must be very careful to distinguish between the actions Turkey took in the last few days, which are illegitimate. You don't play with human beings. You don't tell people or bus them to the border in the winter, telling them the border is open, in order to send a signal to the European Union, because people were freezing there, and I mean, this is manipulating people.
Is it criminal behavior?
It's certainly moral behavior, and when you hinder people leaving, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not going to judge it, I judge it morally. It's completely wrong. I mean, you don't do that. So we are right to be outraged, but let's be very clear. The idea that you are treating people wrongly at borders to send a signal is something the EU has done for years now. You know,
well, before you continue, let's see what...
Nobody should do it, that's what I'm saying. We need to find a solution where people are not freezing at the border.
You are describing, the situation is terrible, everybody agrees. You are describing what Turkey does to the refugees in the EU. The other side of the conflict is these images that we have seen last week. Let's have a look, and you tell me what you think when you saw what happened on the Mediterranean. Here we go. So the Coast Guard of Greece is shooting at refugees in the boats. What did you think when you saw this as the architect of this EU-Turkey deal?
Well, this is what happens when the EU-Turkey deal stops. We had in March 2016 2 options. Greece had 2 options before Turkey put an offer on the table. Mm-hmm. Let everyone who gets into a boat reach the islands, and it was 150,000 in 10 weeks in winter, just before the statement. Let everyone in. In the meantime, the European Union was saying, other countries were saying, we closed the northern border of Greece, so everybody's stuck in Greece.
Yeah.
So there was no solidarity with Greece except to say, you will be a gigantic refugee camp. Right? And I was in Athens in February, there was panic. Or the other option Greece had was this. Violating international law, risking the lives of people in these small boats, throwing away the Refugee Convention, which is drowning in the Aegean, by doing violent pushbacks in the way the Thailand military has been doing for decades with Rohingyas in little boats. Now, in 2016, the Turkish offer put a third option on the table. With the end of that option, what we are now seeing is the European Union choosing brutality. I mean, this is completely illegal. It sends a signal, and in addition, we had the suspension of the right to apply for asylum, which is purely symbolic because nobody who comes to Greece now can even see a caseworker for years because the system is so overloaded. But as a symbol, it says, when Europe is under pressure, we are throwing away a core right, which is in the treaty, which is in our laws, which is in a convention from 1951. So the image to the world is that Europe is faced with pressure, giving up on core values. This must not be the choice.
Could you ever imagine that European coast guards would shoot point blank at a boat with refugees?
Well, it raises a question about the increase of Frontex, because I really ask, we've seen it with Danish Frontex, saying that we don't want to be in this chain of command. We don't want to implement illegal measures. Do you want Dutch, do we want German Coast Guard or border guards implementing this policy?
Yeah, so the situation is a total disaster. We can conclude that,
Yes.
right?
And avoidable. That was the thing.
How? How is it avoidable?
You were so generous to invite me here 4 months ago,
Yes.
in October. And it's online, everybody can see what we discussed 4 months ago. And we said the situation on the islands is explosive. Remember, before Mr. Erdogan said that the border was open.
Right, you knew that this could
Well,
happen.
not only this, there was violence on the islands before. So the real scandal, which we don't talk about a lot, is that there is a loss of control inside EU territory with vigilantes chasing rescue workers, journalists, arriving asylum seekers or migrants, where we are sending a signal that the rule of law, the right of the state and the obligation to protect is breaking down. Now, I'm not blaming here the Greek islands for suffering the last few years and losing patience. But this...
Who are you blaming?
Well, I'm blaming politicians across Europe who've been indifferent to this despite warnings for a very long... including in October, when in this show I was saying that this is explosive, it has to stop.
Did you see the president of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen? She traveled to Greece and she said there on camera, "I thank Greece for being our European shield in these times."
Well, the language that we've seen in the last few days, and there's been worse language from other European leaders, that speaks about an invasion. Let's just pause for a moment and think what that means. We are not talking then about migrants or asylum seekers or refugees. An invasion is enemy soldiers. What do you do with enemy soldiers approaching your border with boats? In 2019, we had 60,000 people reach the Greek islands. If Turkey would have done nothing in the last week, we might have 60,000 people arrived this year, or more.
Are you saying that refugees are being seen now by the EU as enemy soldiers? That's the image.
What does the language of invasion mean?
Yeah.
What does it mean we will take extreme measures of persuasion? When in fact, and this is so important to remember, after the agreement with Turkey, the number of people who came to Europe in 2017 to the islands, 30,000 all year. 2018, 30,000 all year. First half of 2019, the same completely manageable number. Instead of having an abstract debate, we need more border guards. And it turns out we don't even know what they will do practically on the islands. What we should have done is invest in decent conditions on the islands, have fast decisions on who needs protection, and continue to support the country with most refugees in the world, which is Turkey.
Has not happened. So this all happens against the background of the rise of nationalistic parties in Europe, everywhere. Do you think that European leaders are afraid to do anything about this problem now, thinking about maybe their own position, losing elections, etc.?
Well, if they are afraid, then what we've seen recently is completely irrational. You have a program that the whole EU in solidarity has funded that helps people in Turkey, and then
the money is gone. The money is...
Well, why is it not in the new EU budget? Why are we not sending a signal 3 months ago when the last projects were planned in December, and it's not all spent, but it's all been programmed?
Is the why, is the answer to your why because politicians in Europe don't want to spend any money anymore on refugees because they know it will hit them And it will be bad for their re-election campaigns? Or?
The EU budget talks about billions more for security, for migration control, and the most effective measure we've had on migration control that works not by suspending the right to asylum, but by helping refugees. Last year, 99.5% of Syrians did not leave Turkey because they have children in schools. If we do that another 4 years, we have supported, Europe has supported, the integration of a generation. These young people speak Turkish, they can go to health clinics in Turkey, their parents get social support. We should build on this success. To throw it away is strategic blindness of the most extraordinary kind.
So what should happen? You are very emotional about this subject, right?
Well, I see where this is leading.
Where?
When countries suspend core rights in the treaty, I mean, the right to asylum is not something we've just passed yesterday. It's like this. Hungary suspended it a few hours before Greece. Last year, you had less than 600 applications in Hungary, like this. And the Commission, which is responsible, a guardian of the treaties, says nothing. I see a crisis of the rule of law that goes beyond our border and beyond refugees. I see a crisis where member states, with a clear program, remember, Viktor Orban said 4 years ago, this refugee crisis was a chance to get rid of what he called the hypocrisy of international universal human rights. There is an agenda to do away with the whole foundation of international law set down in the 50s. Out of fear, using people's fear, and out of helplessness of politicians who should know better. If this doesn't end, the foundation on which the EU is built is eroding. And I've seen too many countries, I've lived in too many countries where I've seen where this is leading.
Where?
I've lived in the Balkans, I've lived in Turkey. I see what happens when core rights disappear and suddenly people go to jail. I give you one example. Which
well, the Balkans, I've been reporting on the war on the Balkans.
Yes.
Are you saying this could lead to a war?
Look at the language with which refugees and migrants are described in media today in the Balkans. The people who arrive in Greece, where we see vigilantes, people without uniform, beating them up. We are now having a strategy of making it worse to be on our side of the border than outside. The strategy is a competition between the EU and others, in this case Turkey, who can treat people worse, so they prefer to stay on the other side. If these people move on through the Balkans, and you look at the headlines in the newspapers, in the last days in Serbia, the new battle on the Marica, which is the border river between Greece and Turkey, we are preparing an atmosphere for pogroms. We are preparing an atmosphere where people will take it into their own hands to go after enemies, invaders. So we need to step in. We need to calm down our language. And we need to say, listen, what we need to do, we know. We need to have a new statement with Turkey. We need to tell Turkey to stop playing games. We are committed to help refugees in the way we did in the last 4 years.
Do you think that is feasible, that the European leadership will allocate billions of euros to Turkey, a country that is being seen now as an aggressor, and President Erdogan is not very popular in Brussels right now? Do you think that is even realistic, to think that that money will come in to help refugees from Syria and other countries there in Turkey?
Well, first, it's about our interest.
It's self-interest, that's what you are saying, right?
It's our self-interest. It's our self-interest and our values. If we do not want to shoot at refugee boats in the Aegean, which is the abdication of all commitment to the rule of law and human rights, then we need an agreement that helps preserve the right to asylum but improves conditions so people don't get into boats.
If nothing will happen, if the European leadership will not act, what do you foresee?
I don't want to foresee this. I am still hopeful that some leaders in Europe, I've had many meetings, many conversations in recent days, especially in Germany, but also with leaders in other countries. What I see happening, however, is a cynical play. Some European countries are not affected by refugees. They don't go there. They might try, and I think this is one reason why we didn't act fast enough on prolonging the money for the most successful EU project in a third country to prevent migrants, refugees moving on. Yeah. They might want Germany and the Netherlands and France and Greece to pay these next 6 billion alone, because they might think it's not up to us. I think the Commission should have made clear, and should make clear now, and I think member states should make clear, we might not force refugees to every country in Europe, but solidarity in funding healthcare and education for refugees in a country bordering the EU that has worked and reduced migration pressure and preserves the right to asylum in Europe is what Europe is about. And if we can't get solidarity on this quickly, we don't need any discussion, and the documents of new asylum strategies and border strategies are not worth the paper on which they're written.
Gerald Knaus, thank you very much for your visit here to our program. Thank you.
I thank you.